The Richmond County Courthouse stood tall and imposing on that fateful Monday morning in September. Marcus Johnson, a 34-year-old African-American man with deep brown eyes and a reputation for helping troubled youth in his community, straightened his navy blue tie as he walked up the courthouse steps. His heart. Inside Courtroom 4B, the air felt heavy with tension. The wooden benches were filled with Marcus's supporters, fellow community members, his colleagues from the youth center where he volunteered, and his family. His mother, Mrs. Sarah Johnson, sat in the front row, clutching her worn leather purse with trembling hands, her graying hair neatly tied back. Judge William Thorne's reputation preceded him in Richmond County. At 63, he had served on the bench for 15 years, and whispers about his biased sentencing had circulated through the community for just as long. His thin lips and cold gray eyes seemed perpetually set in a disapproving frown, especially when handling cases involving minorities. The case that brought Marcus to the courthouse that day had started as a simple traffic stop 3 months ago. He had been driving home from a late-night youth mentoring session when Officer Peterson pulled him over, claiming he had run a stop sign. Marcus knew he had made a complete stop. He always did, especially in that neighborhood. What should have been a routine traffic stop escalated when the officer claimed he smelled marijuana in the car. Despite Marcus's calm protests and clean record, the situation spiraled into charges of resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. Judge Thorne entered, his black robe flowing behind him as he took his seat at the bench. His gaze swept across the courtroom, lingering disapprovingly on the crowd of supporters before settling on Marcus. Marcus's attorney, James Wilson, a public defender with 20 years of experience, stood beside him. Wilson had seen enough of Judge Thorne's cases to know what they were up against. He had prepared a strong defense, including character witnesses and video evidence from nearby security cameras that showed Marcus had indeed stopped at the sign. Case number 2025 CR 789, State v. Marcus Johnson, the court clerk announced, her voice echoing in the now silent courtroom. Judge Thorne peered over his reading glasses, his fingers drumming impatiently on the bench. "Mr. Johnson," he drawled, emphasizing each syllable as if it left a bad taste in his mouth, "you stand accused of running a stop sign, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct. How do you plead?" Marcus stood straight, his voice clear and respectful. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The trial proceeded with Officer Peterson's testimony, painting Marcus as aggressive and uncooperative during the stop. When Wilson presented the security camera footage, Judge Thorne seemed more interested in his coffee mug than the evidence clearly showing Marcus making the complete stop. Character witnesses took the stand one by one. The director of the youth center spoke about Marcus's dedication to mentoring at-risk teens. A local business owner testified about Marcus's volunteer work organizing community cleanup events. Even Marcus's former high school teacher appeared, describing him as one of the most promising students she'd ever taught. But Judge Thorne's expression remained unmoved. His questions to the witnesses dripped with skepticism, and his interruptions became more frequent as each person spoke in Marcus's favor. When Marcus finally took the stand, the tension in the courtroom could be cut with a knife. He explained his side of the story clearly and calmly, describing how he had cooperated with Officer Peterson despite the officer's increasingly aggressive behavior. "So, Mr. Johnson," Judge Thorne interrupted, leaning forward, "you expect this court to believe that a decorated officer would fabricate charges against an upstanding citizen such as yourself?" His tone made the word upstanding sound like an insult. Marcus maintained his composure, though his hands gripped the witness stand tightly. "I'm simply telling the truth, Your Honor. The video evidence supports my statement." Judge Thorne's eyes narrowed. "The video evidence is inconclusive at best. What we have here is a pattern of disrespect for authority, Mr. Johnson. Your community might view you as some kind of role model, but in my courtroom, the law is the law." Mrs. Johnson let out a soft gasp from her seat, and Marcus's supporters murmured in disbelief. Wilson stood to object, but Judge Thorne silenced him with a sharp bang of his gavel. The morning sun streaming through the high courthouse windows cast harsh shadows across Judge Thorne's face as he prepared to deliver his verdict, unaware that the next few moments would change everything in Courtroom 4B forever. Judge Thorne cleared his throat, shuffling the papers before him with deliberate slowness. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as every person in courtroom 4B held their breath. Marcus stood perfectly still, his attorney James Wilson tensely gripping his legal pad beside him. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Thorne began, his voice carrying traces of contempt, "this court has witnessed a disturbing display of disrespect for law enforcement and the judicial system." He paused, adjusting his glasses with one bony finger. "Your attempts to discredit Officer Peterson's testimony with questionable video evidence and a parade of character witnesses do not change the facts of this case." Sarah Johnson, Marcus's mother, squeezed her purse tighter, her knuckles turning white. She had raised Marcus alone after his father's death, working 2 jobs to put him through college. Now she watched helplessly as years of her son's good work seemed to mean nothing in this courtroom. Furthermore, Judge Thorne continued, his voice growing harder, "Your attitude throughout these proceedings suggests a fundamental lack of understanding of proper behavior. These so-called community service activities." He waved his hand dismissively at the stack of testimonials. "They don't excuse breaking the law." Wilson jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, I must object. The evidence clearly shows my client made a complete stop. The charges of resisting arrest were based solely on." Overruled. Judge Thorne's gavel crashed down. "Mr. Wilson, one more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt." His cold gray eyes shifted back to Marcus. "As I was saying, Mr. Johnson, your type often thinks the rules don't apply to them." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even the court reporter's fingers froze over her stenotype machine. The racial undertone in Judge Thorne's words hung heavy in the air. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs, but he maintained his dignified posture. 15 years of working with troubled youth had taught him that losing control never solved anything. But as he stood there, watching Judge Thorne systematically dismiss every piece of evidence in his favor, something inside him began to crack. The defendant's prior record, though clean, does not offset the severity of these charges, Judge Thorne declared. Resisting arrest shows a dangerous disregard for authority that must be addressed firmly. In the gallery, Marcus's younger sister Tamika whispered urgently to their mother, "Mama, you can't do this. This isn't right." Sarah Johnson placed a trembling hand on her daughter's arm, silently praying for strength. The youth center director, Mr. Reynolds, sat with his fists clenched, watching the injustice unfold. Just yesterday, Marcus had helped a teenager named Diego get into college, the first in his family to do so. The thought of Marcus being taken away from his vital work made Mr. Reynolds' blood boil. Judge Thorne shuffled his papers one final time, drawing out the moment with cruel deliberation. Taking all factors into consideration, this court sentences Marcus Johnson to 2 years in state prison for resisting arrest, with concurrent sentences for the traffic violation and disorderly conduct charges. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs and cries of protest. Wilson immediately began citing similar cases where white defendants had received only probation or community service for more serious offenses. Marcus stood rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to process what was happening. 2 years. 2 years away from his community work, away from the kids who depended on him, away from his aging mother, all because of a traffic stop he knew he had handled correctly. Through the roaring in his ears, Marcus heard his mother's soft weeping. He saw Diego and other teens from the youth center in the back row, their faces twisted with disbelief and anger. He watched Judge Thorne's satisfied smirk as he prepared to bang his gavel one final time. Something snapped. The rational part of Marcus's brain, the part that had always preached patience and peaceful resistance, was drowned out by a tidal wave of rage and injustice. Years of witnessing similar cases, of watching good people's lives destroyed by biased judges like Thorne, crystallized into a single moment of clarity. As Judge Thorne raised his gavel, Marcus's muscles tensed. The bailiff, distracted by the commotion in the gallery, had stepped away from his usual position. The distance between the defendant's table and the judge's bench suddenly seemed very short. In that split second, as the gavel began its descent, Marcus made a decision that would change not only his life, but the entire Richmond County judicial system forever. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Marcus's body moved before his mind could fully process his actions. With explosive speed born from years of high school track, he launched himself forward, clearing the defense table in one fluid motion. Several voices shouted at once. The bailiff's delayed "Hey!" mixed with his mother's terrified Marcus, no, and Wilson's desperate stop. But it was too late. Marcus was already halfway to the judge's bench, his tie flying. Judge Thorne's eyes widened in shock, his gavel frozen mid-descent. The smug expression that had dominated his face seconds ago melted into pure fear as he realized what was happening. He tried to push his chair back, but in his panic, his robe tangled with the wheels. Time seemed to speed up again as Marcus reached the bench. His hands, the same hands that had helped countless kids with their homework and built community gardens, gripped the wooden ledge. In one powerful movement, he vaulted over it. "Security!" Judge Thorne screamed, finally finding his voice. He toppled backward in his chair, landing with an undignified thud as Marcus landed in front of him. The courtroom erupted into chaos. People jumped to their feet, some screaming, others frozen in shock. Sarah Johnson's anguished cry pierced through the cacophony. "Somebody stop this!" Court officers rushed forward, but the crowd's movement blocked their path. Diego and some other teens from the youth center, without thinking, had stepped into the aisle, creating an unintentional barrier. Marcus stood over Judge Thorne, his chest heaving. The judge scrambled backward on the floor, his robe tangled around his legs, his facade of authority completely shattered. For the first time in his 15 years on the bench, he looked small and vulnerable. "You think you can play with people's lives?" Marcus's voice boomed through the courtroom, deeper and more powerful than anyone had ever heard it. "You think you can destroy families with your prejudice?" Judge Thorne raised his hands in front of his face. "Guards, someone restrain this man." Wilson had finally made it around the defense table. "Marcus, think about what you're doing," he pleaded. "Don't give him the satisfaction." But Marcus wasn't finished. He leaned down, his face inches from the judge's. "Every day, I teach kids to believe in the system, to trust that justice is blind. But you make a mockery of everything that robe is supposed to represent." The first court officer finally broke through the crowd, tackling Marcus from behind. They both crashed into Judge Thorne's overturned chair. Two more officers piled on, and Marcus didn't resist as they pinned his arms behind his back. "You're proving me right, Johnson," Judge Thorne shouted as he scrambled to his feet, trying to recover his dignity. His face had turned bright red, and spittle flew from his lips as he screamed. "This is exactly the kind of violent behavior I was talking about." But his words were drowned out by a new sound. Someone in the gallery had started recording on their phone, and the video was already streaming live. In the back of the courtroom, a young reporter who had been covering routine court cases frantically typed on her phone, knowing she had just witnessed something extraordinary. As the officers handcuffed Marcus, his mother pushed through the crowd. "Baby, what have you done?" she sobbed, reaching for him. "It's okay, Mama," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Sometimes you have to stand up, even if it means falling down first." The officers began leading Marcus away. Judge Thorne, now back on his feet and straightening his robe, pointed a shaking finger at him. "Add assault charges. I want the maximum sentence." But something unexpected happened. Mr. Reynolds stood up in the gallery, his voice cutting through the noise. "I saw everything, Your Honor. I saw your prejudice, your bias, and your abuse of power. And now, thanks to modern technology, so will everyone else." He held up his phone, where the live stream count was already climbing into the hundreds. Other phones throughout the courtroom were raised as well, recording every moment. Judge Thorne's face paled as he realized the implications. His words, his actions, his obvious bias, all had been captured and were now spreading across social media platforms. As Marcus was led out of courtroom 4B, his head held high, he caught a glimpse of Diego in the crowd. The young man's eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and admiration. This wasn't the lesson Marcus had planned to teach today, but sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected moments. Outside, news vans were already beginning to arrive, drawn by the viral videos spreading across the internet. What had started as a simple traffic violation was about to become something much bigger, a catalyst for change in the Richmond County justice system. The holding cell in the courthouse basement was cold and dimly lit. Marcus sat on the metal bench, his tie now loosened and his once crisp white shirt wrinkled from the scuffle. Through the small window in the cell door, he could hear the commotion still echoing from upstairs. Officer Jenkins, a veteran courthouse deputy who had known Marcus from his community work, stood guard outside the cell. He kept glancing at Marcus with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. Upstairs, the courthouse had transformed into a media circus. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, their microphones ready as various witnesses emerged to tell their stories. Sarah Johnson stood surrounded by supporters, her tears now replaced by a fierce determination. "My son has spent his life building bridges in this community," she told the gathered reporters. Judge Thorne spent 15 minutes tearing down everything Marcus worked for. But what happened today, that wasn't just about Marcus. It was about every person who ever sat in that courtroom feeling helpless while justice turned its back on them. Inside his chambers, Judge Thorne was facing his own crisis. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. The video of his biased comments and Marcus's reaction had gone viral, spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. His secretary had already counted calls from 3 national news networks and the state's Judicial Review Board. The judge's hands shook as he watched the footage on his computer screen. His words, played back to him, sounded even worse than he remembered. The racial undertones in his statements were unmistakable. Worse still, someone had compiled a thread of similar comments he'd made in other cases, creating a damaging pattern that couldn't be explained away. Meanwhile, in the courthouse parking lot, James Wilson was giving an impromptu press conference. "My client's actions, while regrettable, were the result of years of systematic bias in Judge Thorne's courtroom. We have documentation of dozens of cases where similar charges resulted in vastly different sentences based solely on the defendant's race." The youth center director, Mr. Reynolds, stood nearby with a group of teenagers, including Diego. They held hastily made signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and "End Judicial Bias." Diego's voice shook with emotion as he spoke to a local reporter. "Marcus taught us to believe in the system, to work within it. But today, the system showed its true face. How are we supposed to trust judges who don't even try to hide their prejudice?" Back in the holding cell, Marcus received his first visitor, Reverend Michael Thompson from the First Baptist Church. The elderly minister sat across from Marcus, his weathered face etched with concern. "Son," Reverend Thompson began, "what you did up there, it's going to have consequences." Marcus leaned forward, his handcuffs clinking. "I know, Reverend, but maybe that's what we needed. Maybe sometimes you have to break the silence to fix the system." The Reverend nodded slowly. "The question is, what happens now? Judge Thorne's going to throw everything he can at you." A small smile crossed Marcus's face. "Maybe. But for the first time, people are watching, really watching." Outside the holding cell, Officer Jenkins overheard a conversation between 2 court clerks. The state's Judicial Review Board was sending representatives immediately. The governor's office had released a statement promising a thorough investigation into judicial bias in Richmond County. Sarah Johnson had finally made her way down to see her son. Officer Jenkins, after a moment's hesitation, let her through. She rushed to Marcus, touching his face through the cell bars. "Baby, what were you thinking?" she whispered, but her voice held more pride than anger. "I was thinking about Diego, Mama, about all the kids I work with, about how they watch everything we do, how they learn from how we handle injustice. Sometimes you have to show them that standing up isn't just something you talk about, it's something you do." As evening approached, the courthouse began to empty, but the media presence only grew. News helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights illuminating the growing crowd of supporters holding candlelight vigils on the courthouse steps. Inside his cell, Marcus could hear the faint sound of voices chanting his name, but his thoughts weren't on his newfound notoriety. Instead, he wondered about tomorrow's youth center meeting, about who would help Diego with his college applications, about all the work left undone. What he didn't know yet was that his actions that day had set in motion changes that would reach far beyond Richmond County's borders. The next morning dawned with an intensity that surprised even the most seasoned courthouse employees. The story had exploded overnight, dominating national news headlines and social media trends. Hashtag Judge Thorne must go and hashtag Justice for Marcus were trending nationwide. Marcus's first court appearance was scheduled for 9 a.m., this time before Judge Patricia Martinez in Courtroom 2A. Marcus met with his new legal team. After the previous day's events, top civil rights attorneys had offered to represent him pro bono. Among them was Benjamin Harris, a legendary civil rights lawyer known for taking on systemic racism in the justice system. The video of Judge Thorne has been viewed over 10 million times, Harris explained, spreading newspapers across the table. But more importantly, people are coming forward. We've received hundreds of emails from former defendants in his courtroom, all sharing similar experiences of bias. Marcus straightened his borrowed tie. His original one was still in evidence. What about the assault charges? Harris's eyes sparkled with determination. We're building a case around the pattern of judicial misconduct. Judge Thorne's comments weren't just inappropriate. They were a clear violation of judicial ethics. We've also uncovered some interesting statistics about his sentencing history. In another part of the courthouse, Judge Thorne sat in his chambers, facing the state's Judicial Review Board. 3 stern-faced officials listened as he tried to explain away his actions. My comments were taken out of context, he insisted, sweat beading on his forehead. I've always treated every defendant with the same. Save it, William, interrupted Judge Sarah Chen, the board's chairwoman. We spent the night reviewing your cases from the past 5 years. The numbers tell a different story. African American defendants in your courtroom received sentences averaging 40% longer than white defendants for identical charges. Thorne's face paled. He hadn't realized anyone was keeping track. Meanwhile, in the courthouse lobby, Sarah Johnson gave another interview, this time to a national morning show. Diego stood beside her, wearing his college acceptance letter like a badge of honor. Marcus helped me believe in myself, Diego told the cameras. He showed me that my background didn't define my future. But yesterday, he taught me something even more important, that sometimes you have to risk everything to fight injustice. At exactly 9 a.m., Marcus entered courtroom 2A. The room was packed, with news cameras broadcasting the proceedings live. Judge Martinez, known for her fair-mindedness, surveyed the scene with careful attention. The prosecutor, feeling the weight of public scrutiny, approached the bench. Your Honor, given the circumstances and new evidence regarding Judge Thorne's conduct, the state wishes to review the original charges that led to yesterday's incident. In the gallery, Mr. Reynolds sat with a laptop, monitoring social media reactions. A video compilation of Judge Thorne's most biased moments had gone viral, along with statistics showing the disparities in his sentencing. Civil rights organizations were calling for a review of every case he had presided over in the past decade. Benjamin Harris stood to address the court. Your Honor, we move to dismiss all charges against Mr. Johnson. The events of yesterday were the direct result of a pattern of judicial misconduct that has finally been exposed. My client's actions, while unorthodox, have revealed systemic issues that demand immediate attention. Judge Martinez listened carefully, occasionally glancing at Marcus. Unlike Thorne, she saw not a stereotype but a community leader pushed to his breaking point by years of witnessed injustice. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown larger. Community leaders from across the state stood shoulder to shoulder with Marcus's youth center kids. Local business owners who knew Marcus's work distributed water and snacks to the supporters. Sarah Johnson sat in the front row of the courtroom, watching the proceedings with quiet dignity. She remembered teaching young Marcus about standing up for what's right, never imagining it would lead to this moment. As Judge Martinez prepared to make her initial ruling, a court officer passed her a note. The state's Supreme Court had just announced the formation of a special committee to investigate bias in the judicial system, with Richmond County as its first focus. Marcus sat straight in his chair, feeling the weight of the moment. What had started as a personal stand against injustice had sparked a movement larger than himself. In the back of his mind, he could already see how this would become another teaching moment for his kids at the youth center, a real-life lesson about courage, consequences, and the long arc of justice. Chin. Judge Martinez's courtroom fell silent as she prepared to deliver her initial ruling. Her dark eyes moved thoughtfully from the stack of documents before her to Marcus, then to the packed gallery. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, creating long shadows across the floor. Before I proceed, she began, her voice clear and measured, I want to address something unprecedented that has occurred in the past 20th. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Benjamin Harris leaned forward, his fingers interlocked on the defense table. Behind him, Sarah Johnson reached for her daughter Tamika's hand. Furthermore, Judge Martinez continued, The FBI's Civil Rights Division has opened an investigation into systematic discrimination within our county's judicial system. This morning, they seized Judge Thorne's private court records dating back 15 years. In his office across town, Judge Thorne watched the proceedings on television, his hands trembling as he poured his third drink of the morning. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from other judges distancing themselves from him. His country club membership had been suspended. Even his own daughter had posted a statement on social media expressing shame over his actions. Back in the courtroom, Judge Martinez shuffled her papers. "Mr. Johnson," she addressed Marcus directly. "While this court cannot condone physical confrontation in a courtroom, we cannot ignore the circumstances that led to your actions. The evidence of judicial misconduct in your original case is substantial." Marcus sat straight, his expression calm but alert. Diego and several other youth center teenagers watched from the back row, hanging on every word. "Therefore," Judge Martinez declared, "I am ordering a complete review of your original case. Until that review is completed, you will be released on your own recognizance. As for the charges stemming from yesterday's incident," the room held its collective breath. "Given the extraordinary circumstances and clear evidence of judicial provocation, I am reducing the assault charge to disorderly conduct. You will be required to perform 100 hours of community service." A small smile crossed Benjamin Harris's face. Everyone in the room knew Marcus would complete those hours doing exactly what he'd always done, helping his community. Sarah Johnson let out a quiet "Thank you, Jesus," as supporters in the gallery struggled to contain their joy. Even some of the court officers looked relieved. Outside the courthouse, the news spread quickly through the crowd. Cheers erupted, and the chants of "Justice for Marcus" transformed into songs of celebration. Local food trucks that had been feeding the supporters all morning began giving out free meals in celebration. But the story wasn't over. In a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, state investigators were setting up what would become known as the Richmond County Judicial Review Task Force. They had already received over 500 emails and calls from former defendants sharing their experiences with Judge Thorne and other judges. Mr. Reynolds, still monitoring social media, watched as legal advocacy groups from across the country began offering support. Law schools were requesting permission to use the case in their ethics classes. Civil rights organizations were organizing town halls to discuss judicial reform. Marcus's youth center kids had turned their support into action, creating a website to collect stories of judicial bias and connecting victims with legal resources. Diego, inspired by the events, announced his decision to change his college major to pre-law. As Marcus prepared to leave the courthouse, Benjamin Harris pulled him aside. "This isn't just a victory for you," the attorney said quietly. "You've opened a door that needed opening. People are finally paying attention to something we've been trying to expose for years." Sarah Johnson waited by the courthouse steps, surrounded by reporters. When Marcus emerged, she wrapped him in a tight embrace, whispering, "Your father would be so proud." Marcus looked out at the crowd, the teenagers from his youth center, the community members who had supported him, the reporters carrying his story to the world. He saw hope in their faces, a belief that change was possible. "Mr. Johnson," a reporter called out, "what's your message to other judges who might show similar bias?" Marcus thought for a moment before responding. "The law should be like a mirror," he said carefully. "When people look at it, they should all see the same reflection, regardless of their race or background. Yesterday showed us that the mirror in Richmond County was distorted. Now it's our job to fix it." As he walked down the courthouse steps, Marcus knew this was just the beginning. The real work, the long, hard work of systemic change, was still ahead. But for the first time in years, it felt possible. 2 weeks after the courthouse incident, Richmond County was experiencing changes that no one could have predicted. The state's Judicial Review Task Force had set up permanent offices in the courthouse basement, their conference room walls covered with charts and timelines documenting decades of biased sentencing. Judge Thorne had officially resigned, but his troubles were far from over. The FBI's investigation had expanded beyond his courtroom, uncovering a network of judges who had systematically discriminated against minorities. Marcus returned to the youth center, where his small office had become an unofficial headquarters for judicial reform. Community members streamed in daily, sharing their stories of courtroom discrimination. Law students volunteered their time to help document cases, and civil rights attorneys held free legal clinics every weekend. "You've started something big," Benjamin Harris told Marcus one evening, watching volunteers sort through case files. "We've identified over 1,000 cases that need review. Some of these people have been sitting in prison for years based on biased rulings." Diego had become a regular fixture at the center, helping organize the growing mountain of evidence. His college acceptance letter hung proudly on the wall, next to a new sign that read, "Future Civil Rights Attorney." "Marcus," Diego called out, waving a folder. "Remember that kid you helped last year, James Thompson? Turns out Judge Thorne gave him 5 years for the same offense that got 3 white defendants only probation. We got all the documentation right here." Sarah Johnson had also found a new purpose. She organized a support group for families affected by biased sentencing, meeting in the church basement every Tuesday night. The group grew so large they had to move to the community center. One morning, as Marcus arrived at the youth center, he found an unexpected visitor waiting. Judge Patricia Martinez stood in the parking lot, holding a thick manila envelope. "Mr. Johnson," she greeted him formally. "I've been reviewing cases all week. What we're finding—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It's worse than anyone imagined. The state Supreme Court has authorized a complete overhaul of the county's judicial system." Inside the envelope were documents outlining the proposed changes: mandatory bias training for all court officials, regular review of sentencing patterns, and a new civilian oversight committee. At the bottom was a request for Marcus to serve as a community liaison during the reform process. Meanwhile, the media attention hadn't faded. National news magazines ran profiles of Marcus, not focusing on the courtroom confrontation, but on his years of community work. Documentary filmmakers followed the youth center kids, capturing their transformation from observers to activists. Mr. Reynolds expanded the center's programs to include legal education workshops. "We're not just teaching them about the law," he explained to a reporter. "We're teaching them how to change it." The changes rippled beyond Richmond County. Other jurisdictions began examining their own sentencing patterns. Law schools updated their ethics curricula to include more focus on judicial bias. Civil rights organizations reported increased support and funding. One afternoon, as Marcus helped Diego with his pre-law studies, a familiar face appeared at the youth center door. Officer Jenkins, the courthouse deputy who had guarded Marcus's cell, stood awkwardly in the doorway. "I've been thinking about that day," Jenkins said, stepping inside, "about all the times I saw things that didn't seem right but didn't say anything. I want to help. I've got 20 years of courthouse observations that might be useful to your cause." Sarah Johnson organized a community celebration in the park across from the courthouse. Families shared stories of hope and redemption. Children played on the grass while their parents spoke with legal volunteers. The atmosphere was one of determination rather than anger, of looking forward rather than back. As the sun set over Richmond County, Marcus sat in his office, reviewing the day's cases. On his desk sat a framed photo of his father, who had always taught him to stand up for what's right. Next to it was a new plaque from the Civil Rights Legal Defense Fund, recognizing his courage in confronting systemic injustice. But what made him proudest was the sight through his window. Teenagers like Diego, hunched over law books, preparing for a future where they would continue the fight for justice. The youth center had become more than a safe space. It was now an incubator for change. Sometimes, Marcus thought, watching his students work, it takes one moment of courage to start years of change. He picked up another case file, ready to continue the work that was far from finished, but finally, undeniably, moving in the right direction. 1 year after the courthouse incident, Richmond County had become a national model for judicial reform. The changes that began with Marcus's stand against injustice had grown into something far larger than anyone could have imagined. On a bright autumn morning, Marcus stood at the podium in the same courthouse where everything had started. The building looked different now, renovated, more welcoming, with a new citizens' help desk in the lobby and informational displays about legal rights in multiple languages. In the front row, Sarah Johnson wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her son speak. Beside her sat Diego, now finishing his first year of law school. He had earned a full scholarship, inspired by the events he witnessed that day in court. Over the past year, Marcus continued, We've reviewed more than 2,000 cases of potential judicial bias. 537 people have been released from unjust sentences, but numbers don't tell the whole story. He gestured to the gallery, where families reunited through the case review process sat together. Children who had grown up without parents were finally whole again. Communities torn apart by biased sentencing were healing. The youth center had expanded, now occupying an entire building. Its programs included legal education, advocacy training, and support services for families affected by the justice system. Mr. Reynolds had retired, but still visited regularly, proud of how his small community center had evolved into a beacon of hope. Benjamin Harris, who had become a close friend and mentor, stood up to speak next. The Richmond model, as it's now known, has been adopted by 12 other counties across the country. But more importantly, it has shown us that change is possible when people stand together. Officer Jenkins, now heading the courthouse's new Community Relations Division, nodded in agreement. His decision to share his observations of judicial misconduct had inspired other law enforcement officers to speak up about injustice they witnessed. The local news cameras rolled as Marcus unveiled the courthouse's new mission statement. Equal justice under law. Every case, every time. Below it hung photographs documenting the year's progress, review sessions, community meetings, family reunions, and graduation ceremonies for those who had received second chances. Sarah Johnson's support group had grown into a national network, connecting families affected by judicial bias and providing resources for legal appeals. She had become a powerful advocate in her own right, testifying before state legislatures about the importance of judicial oversight. After the ceremony, Marcus returned to the youth center. The walls were covered with college acceptance letters and law school admissions notices. Many of his former students were following Diego's path into legal careers, determined to continue the work of reform from within the system. "You know what's funny?" Diego said, helping Marcus sort through new case files. "A year ago, I was scared to even walk into a courthouse. Now I'm planning to work in one." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows as families gathered for the weekly legal clinic. Benjamin Harris supervised law students as they helped community members understand their rights. In the corner, a group of teenagers worked on a social media campaign about knowing your rights during police encounters. Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from the state Supreme Court. They wanted him to help develop new guidelines for judicial conduct training. Another message showed a news alert. 3 more counties had announced plans to adopt the Richmond model. As evening approached, Sarah Johnson brought dinner to the center, just as she had done countless times before. But now, instead of feeding just a few troubled teens, she was serving a room full of activists, lawyers, students, and community leaders, all working together for change. Marcus stood at his office window, watching the sunset paint the courthouse in golden light. The building no longer represented fear and injustice. Instead, it had become a symbol of what people could achieve when they refused to accept the status quo. On his desk sat a framed copy of the viral video that had started it all, next to his father's picture and a letter from a recently released inmate thanking him for changing the system. But what made him smile most was the sound of young voices in the next room, planning tomorrow's projects, designing new programs, and believing in their power to make a difference. The story of Richmond County's transformation wasn't over, it was just beginning. And somewhere, in another courthouse, another person was standing up, ready to fight for justice, inspired by what had happened here.